Hi, I'm John Lynch from University of Colorado's Center for Research on Consumer Financial Decision Making. So, should behavioral economics have a grand unified theory, or is the best we can do to have kind of a culture of experimentation? I say that we can't be very effective without a theory. But I would say it needn't be a grand theory. A famous psychologist, Kurt Lewin, said there's nothing so practical as a good theory. Without a theory, we don't know what we should be experimenting about. So the theory basically helps give us focus and helps us interpret what's coming back. But I don't think it's the case for behavioral economics that there's going to be one theory. So we're going to have a set of smaller theories that cover certain phenomena, like prospect theory, like theories about hyperbolic discounting, intertemporal choice, etc. But if we don't have a theory and we're just experimenting, then we're really not doing what we need to as academics. So the theory really helps guide us in what to experiment about, but we have to be ready to be surprised.
Can we ever have a kind of grand unifying theory that covers human behavior? Well, probably not. The truth of the matter is that our behavior has been formed, in a sense, by contradictory factors. If you look at things like popular phrases and proverbs, they're often actually pairs of opposites. Look before you leap, who dares wins, etc. Faint heart never won fair lady, etc. And most real-world human behavior doesn't really have a right answer. We can simply make good bets based on the information we have available and a very vague grasp of the possible consequences of one decision versus another. Now, just because we'll never have a perfect theory, that doesn't mean we should stop trying. If you look at a much simpler field than human behavior, certainly much simpler than mass human behavior, which is meteorology, they accepted, once they understood complexity theory, that perfect predictability of weather is impossible beyond a certain point. After about 10 to 15 days, butterfly effects make it essentially impossible to know what's going to happen. However, that's not to say that you can't get much better at what you're doing. I think it's recorded in the very, very good book, actually, The Signal and the Noise by Nate Silver, that if you look at meteorology, it's now, and this is a very poor use of English, twice as good as it was 20 years ago. I think in the mid-90s, you would find that they could predict the path of an incoming hurricane with a kind of accuracy to within a width of a corridor of about 400 miles. Now it's down to 200 miles. I think a 4-day forecast now is about as accurate as a 2-day forecast was in 1994. A 6-day forecast is about as good as a 3-day forecast was in 1994. So just because you'll never be perfectly right doesn't mean you can't get a hell of a lot better. The definition of a science isn't really and the whole scientific method isn't really about attainment of perfection, certainly not in the social sciences or the complex sciences. It's actually just about getting better at what you do. Now there, I'm very, very optimistic. I think that if we could only understand and predict human behavior 5 to 10% better than we do at present, I think the economic gains and the social gains could be spectacular and kind of exponential. So just as meteorologists have basically acknowledge the limits to their potential and capabilities, we should do the same, but that doesn't mean we should stop trying to improve. Why do I think it's never possible to be perfect? Well, even if human behavior is simple, the environment isn't. Once you place a second human being on the map, part of our behavior is to copy what they do. That adds a huge layer of complexity to the whole thing. If you have 20 people, it gets more complex still. Our environment, basically, even if our reaction to our environment is theoretically simple, the environment we face in the real world is emphatically not. And so our behavior will be, to some extent, impossible to model on Newtonian physics. It will never be that simple. It's also probably fair to say that our brains are multi-modular. We don't always use the same mental techniques or the same parts of our brain to solve apparently identical problems. It's also fair to say that people's behavior is different, just genetically and for other reasons, and goodness knows, other reasons of just our history, our upbringing, our past, and so forth. No two humans will behave in the same way. So the idea that you can have this grand unifying theory seems to be pretty unlikely. On the other hand, that doesn't mean you shouldn't be optimistic. That's a completely false category error. To try and model social science on Newtonian physics is a complete mistake. It's a completely different kind of thing. The levels of complexity, the levels of uncertainty are much greater. However, it's worth remembering that most progress doesn't happen because someone comes up with a brilliant, perfect theory which applies to everything. Not even Newtonian physics actually met that condition. Most progress is made because you stop doing things that are really crap and start doing things that are a little bit better. And I occasionally contentiously say that actually business and capitalism are slightly better at making progress than academia for this reason. Because in academia you really are engaged in a massive attempt to be right, to come up with some fantastic theory. If you want to succeed in business, you don't have to be right. You don't even have to know what you're doing. You just have to do things that are a bit less stupid than the things your competitors are doing. And if you look at progress in that way, which is stochastically, and you understand that stochastic activities, trial and error, are still science, then you can realize that there's nothing unscientific about quite a lot of what the social science does. It just has a different order of complexity to deal with. So no, don't look necessarily for the answer to solve all things. On the other hand, progress, yep, you can make a lot of it.
So the question on whether we can achieve a grand theory or a central framework to describe decision making, I think is a good debate, a good question to raise. Definitely over the last 5, 10, 15, 20, even further back, we've seen a lot of effort with respect to providing more understanding when it comes to decision making, how we as humans, as consumers, make decisions. And we've had lots of little bits added to what you could call a framework. But I think, at least in my opinion, as we've evolved as scientists and as a field, what's become clear, at least to me, is it's not easy. And I'm skeptical that we'll ever have one complete picture, one complete answer. And I say that for a couple of reasons. One, of course, is the complexity, in my mind, of decision making in and of itself. There's so many different ways to cut the dice here. There's so many different ways to think about decision making, and so many different contexts, situations, drivers, motivations that make up the pie, that I think it's going to be difficult to provide one overarching framework. Now, certainly there's some very specific true principles that we can look to and build on, but I do believe that providing some simple, parsimonious, grand theory is probably going to be difficult to do. The second thing, beyond just difficulty and complexity, is the fact that it seems to be somewhat dynamic, just like human beings and decision making is in general. And what I mean by that is we as people and as decision makers are evolving. And there's different things that pop up, different things that become interesting, whether it's facilitated by technology, facilitated by different exposure to other cultures, lots of different drivers that make it in some ways a living, growing, dynamic field in and of itself. And as such, it becomes very difficult to truly track what would be one simple theory or one simple answer. So when I'm asked the question, are we going to get there? It's a living science, and I think we're going to continue to add bits and pieces as we move forward that further our understanding and give us a broader depth when it comes to decision making. But I don't think that we're ever going to be done.
Well, about grand theory, I think this question per se may reflect some bias. Why do we need a grand theory? I think the pursuit of a grand theory among scholars is somewhat like children pursue a fairyland or people pursuing one god. But maybe there isn't just one god. Maybe there isn't a utopia or a fairyland. So I think the fact that we have empirically accumulated different accumulated different pieces of knowledge, and we can use these different pieces of knowledge to predict, to explain, predict, and control the environment. I think this is great. Maybe there isn't a grand theory. Maybe we don't need a grand theory. And I think this is just an illusion that there should be one grand unifying theory. So I think we should respect empirical evidence. We should respect the reality rather than pursue something that may or may not exist at all. So, in all, I think the pursuit of one grand theory may be a bias in and of itself.
Well, what I feel most excited about, and I'm leaning towards the position, is actually we have a culture of experimentation where we can actually explore and investigate, the variety of human behaviors. I think theory is important whenever we try to do hypothesis testing, but the question here is whether we can have a grand or unified theory about human behavior. There are grand unified theories perhaps about universe, maybe we're going towards there. I'm actually not sure if such position will be possible for human psychology. Looking at the history of economics, there certainly has a sort of embryo of a unified theory, the assumption that everybody acts according to their self-interest and they behave rationally. How far that has gotten us in terms of completely understanding the sort of diversity and the multiplicity of human behaviors. One of the most exciting things about behavioral economics is that they have discovered places or times where this sort of unified or singularity of sort of human rationality assumption actually doesn't hold. That people's psychology and their behavior is much more complex than could be simply summarized by this idea of self-interest or rationality. I think a lot of the debate between this is not just happening within economics or between sort of traditional economic theory and behavioral economics, but also happening in sort of other fields of social science in general. In psychology, for instance, or psychology has been criticized as being sort of a field without a unified or grand theory. But I think looking at compare sort of, for example, economics and psychology, I don't think we can make a judgment about which approach is better or worse. I think both of them probably can contribute to our understanding of human psychology and behavior in different ways.